Hey, Olivia.
Hello.
How are you?
Good, good. I was a little bit nervous that I didn't know how to work this thing, so I'm
Well,
glad that I was able to.
yeah, you joined really quick, so that's good. I was just doing my general haze. I used to do these lives all the time, and then started my my started my training contract, and I haven't done one since March last year. So,
No,
so
wow.
I'm really glad you're my first one. Thank you so much for agreeing to do it.
Happy to be here. Happy to be here.
Good.
I have my notes ready to answer any questions.
I have my notes too.
Ah.
Make sure I don't miss out any questions, guys. Thank you so much for to everyone who sent me in questions. We will go through as many questions as possible during the live. If you haven't sent me in a question, but during the live you think of anything that you would like us to run through, feel free to send me a message. At the bottom of your screen, you should see the question icon. If you send me a question during the live, and we have time at the end, we'll get to those as well. I think we can get started. I don't know if you want to start by kind of giving everyone a background and an overview of your legal journey to date, and then we can go into each thing in a bit more detail.
That sounds good. So I'm Olivia. I'm a data protection and technology lawyer. I qualified in March of this year. Prior to that, I'd worked in data protection on the compliance and the operational side for around 5 years. And then I slightly changed trajectories to qualify as being to be a lawyer. In terms of kind of career trajectory to date, like I said, I worked in the operational side of data protection for 5 years. That was very much by chance. I studied law. I initially wanted to do criminal law, then that changed to family law, then that changed to personal injury. And it was in the last year of law school that I essentially needed a job, and my local council had a job in data protection. So
There you go.
yeah, and the rest is history.
Yeah, of course. Amazing. Okay, and it's funny you said that, because I think when people go into law or think about a career in law, they always think they know what area of law they want to qualify into, what type of lawyer they want to be. And I think it was kind of the same for me. I thought, yeah, criminal, because that's what you see and you hear the most about. It's like fighting crime and all of that. And then I also went into family law and thought, yeah, family law, you know, families. And then, okay, I didn't go down the route you went. I thought, okay, maybe employment. Personal injury is not for me. I don't like blood and gore. And all that. But it's nice to see that you thought about a number of different areas of law before you went down the route that you went down into. So I think with that being said, obviously you went to a non-Russel Group university where you did law there. And a question that I get really often, especially from non-Russel Group students and graduates, is how do you feel like that affected the opportunities that you had or your ability to get a training contract, because there's such emphasis on going to Russel Group University?
Yeah. I think it definitely played a part, and rightly or wrongly so. I was very realistic with myself as to the types of firms that I could apply to. But I also think that made me more kind of hungry, and it also made me more strategic with how I was approaching training contracts, how I internships. So yeah, I think, you know, ultimately it's led me to where I am now. So, you know, that goes to say that it's not impossible if you don't go to a non-Russel Group uni, but it does make it harder. I would definitely say things like work experience, internships are really, really valuable. For me, the fact that I worked in the operational side for 5 years was amazing, because when I decided to retrain, yes, okay, there was some very technical legal stuff that I didn't necessarily know. I had, you know, the benefit of working in an office environment, client facing as well, having to deal with client demands, and that ultimately has helped me tons. So I would say for anyone that doesn't go to a Russel Group uni, that doesn't necessarily mean that you won't make it. It might make it more difficult, but there's always going to be exceptions to the rules. And, you know, I've done a few of these talks, especially at my old union. One of the things that I've said is that I do definitely think now the legal sector has changed so much in the sense that, you know, the uni that you go to, even arguably the grades that you have aren't the be all and end all, and law firms are a lot more holistic as to how they view candidates. and how they're assessing candidates. So ultimately, I wouldn't say that will be a big deal breaker.
No, definitely. And I agree with everything you've said. And I think you touched on a lot of really important points. I think the first point that was really important was your emphasis on like legal experience. I think the university you go to is one thing, but gaining the legal experience and actually obtaining the skills that they're actually going to look for in your application form and throughout the application process is what's ultimately going to determine whether they think that you'll be the right trainee for their firm. So with that being said, like what or how did you go about looking for legal work experience?
So I'll go about how I went about it.
Yeah.
I've used some kind of tips that I think will be helpful. So how I went about it is I actually was quite strategic about it. So I didn't immediately go for the really big firms. I actually went for my local law firm in Nottingham, high street law firm, because the reality is experience is experience.
Yeah, of course.
And broadly speaking, the types of tasks that you're doing them whether you're working at a very small high street law firm or a very big law firm. And I actually felt that the smaller law firms were a lot more receptive, and also because it was more times not a very small firm, some of the work that you was doing was actually a lot more kind of high caliber than if you were in a really big law firm. One thing I will say, so I worked in retail from the age of 16 up to I think perhaps 22, and that's actually one thing I want to really reinforce, that it's amazing if we get legal work experience, that's great, but there's also so many other jobs that you can get that have of transferable skills into the legal sector. So, you know, with my retail days, managing customers' expectations, just being personal, thinking on my feet, all of those things are transferable into the legal sector. So, you know, I kind of want to make that clear that it's not just legal experience that holds weight. And even if you can't get legal experience, that's okay. There's so many other, you know, areas that are linked to law where you might be able to get experience. So, for example, on the compliance side, whether that's general compliance, whether that's, you know, financial compliance, what I do, data protection compliance. So, you know, there's so many other avenues out there for you to get experience without it just being legal.
Yeah.
And yeah, they all have value.
No, definitely. I would completely agree. And I think in commercial law and corporate law in particular, it's a lot harder to get work experience than, say, if you want to go into a criminal law and you can kind of go to any law firm at any time or know any criminal lawyer and they can just give you work experience. Like corporate commercial law tends to be a lot more rigid when it comes to application forms and dates and stuff like that. And I think graduate recruitment know that and they understand that. And especially if you're applying for training contracts in your second, third year, even as a recent graduate, they know that the amount of work experience that is on offer is limited compared to how much applicants there are. So being able to really communicate the skills you develop from non-legal work experience is more important than having lots of legal work experiences and you can't really communicate what it is you did or what it is you learned or what value you'd be able to bring to their firm having done that. So I think that's important. And another thing that you mentioned a little bit previously was how law firms take a lot of things into consideration when considering the application form. So it's not just the grades and it's not just the university. And yes, those things have an impact. But like you said, like what work experience you've done, how you communicate that. And I think when you're in a situation where you can't control certain factors, like you can't control the fact you've already been to an almost group university, for example, focus on the things that you can control and make sure that your application is strong in those areas. So yeah, I just wanted to add that little 2 pence before we move on. Okay, cool. So you did your work experience and then you ended up at PwC doing a training contract. How did that happen? What was the application process like? Talk to us.
So I think I want to take a step back and speak a little bit about my operational experience because it will make sense why I did my training contract at PwC. Okay. So I got a job at my local council at the time doing data protection in Nottingham. Then I moved back to London and started data protection, and I did data compliance for cancer research, and then I moved to PwC. a little bit more about kind of PwC, its legal offering. But essentially, PwC is what they call a multidisciplinary firm. So it's essentially various lawyers, accountants, actuaries, consultants, all under one bubble. And that the legal team was a hybrid of lawyers and non-lawyers. I was part of the legal team, but I was a non-lawyer because I wasn't qualified.
Yeah.
And then essentially I was there for three years. I did a number of things. I went on a number of client secondments, and then it got to a point where I was kind of operating like a lawyer, but without having
the title and the pay and everything else.
So always the way. I decided, okay, right, let's train to be a lawyer, and PwC offers training contracts, and so I went down that route. In terms of application process, it might have changed, but they have an application form, a psychometric test, which I know they also changed to be some form of game, an assessment center, and then they're one of the firms that only recruit solely from their back schemes. The back schemes are 3 weeks long, and although I was internal, I had to do those 3 weeks.
Yeah.
So I had
politics.
So I had to do the 3 weeks, and at the end of each week there was a different task. So some of them were negotiations. What else did I have to do? A mock trial, and then I think I had a written exam. This was all amongst doing the work for the various teams that I was in that week. So I trained at PwC in terms of kind of seats that I did. So I did my first seat in pensions, my second seat in corporate, and then my last seat I got seconded to PwC's internal legal team, so the Office of General Counsel, where I sat in the litigation and regulatory investigations team. And just a little bit about PwC, and it's a very, very big misconception. Yes. PwC is not in-house. It's right. Not in-house. It is externally facing. They have external clients, some big clients like the likes of BP, and they just essentially operate as a law firm, but in an ABS, so an alternative business structure. They take trainees, they do full seat rotations, they do secondments both internationally and also client secondments. So that's kind of another thing. And I think even if a person isn't going to apply to PwC, I think it's very worthwhile for them understanding the wider legal market and seeing. I remember when I was applying for the traditional law firms, there were so many about what do you think will shape the legal sector in 5 years now, and ABSs are actually a really big competitor because what they're able to provide clients is a one-stop shop. So a client can come to PwC and they'd be able to get legal advice, they'd be able to get consultant advice, accounting advice, and it was the case then and is the case now where clients are very concerned about their legal spends. So to the extent that they're able to get it all under one, you know, that's a big attraction. So kind of want to make that point. In terms of what it was like training at PwC, I think, and I know we're going to talk about the differences between in-house private practice, but I definitely think training at PwC made me a really, really, really well-rounded and more pragmatic professional. So for example, in my pension seat, I not only was working with pensions lawyers, I was working with actuaries, I was working with pensions consultants. So you not only understand the legal aspects, which every lawyer needs to understand, but I actually think the pragmatic, you know, the pragmatic side and also the operational side has a lot of weight too. So yes, that's what I would say about PwC.
It's honestly amazing, and I had to stop and take notes because I was like, there's so many things you covered that I think is really great to pick up on and kind of go into a bit more detail about. And it's really nice to hear the experience you've had and your clarification, because I definitely was one of those people who called it in-house, because in my mind I'm thinking, like, obviously I work for a law firm who does have ABSs as clients. So in my mind I'm like, you're a company, you're an in-house, and you're, like you said, they're not. Like, they are their own standalone firms. So I'm really glad you made that distinction, because otherwise it could have got really awkward in someone's interview. So that's good. In terms of what you said about like ABSs and how they are massive competitors to traditional law firms, that is a big point, because it was an interview question that I received in one of the interviews I've had in the past, and really understand the difference between ABSs, so alternative business structures, for those who are not too sure about the acronym, and how they differ to law firms and what the differences are, and understanding why and what it is they bring to the market. And I think you clarified that really well. In terms of your TCC, so you spoke about like corporate, pensions, and then your in-house secondment to a legal team. I thought that was really interesting, because in my mind, I didn't think PwC had like a corporate team or a pensions team. And I was just wondering whether they were compulsory seats you had to do, or whether you had like an option in terms of what department you sat in and how that kind of worked.
So it is very much like your traditional law firm, in the sense that they have a number of seats. So I'll kind of give you a brief. So they have an employment seat, IP, commercial, data protection, corporate. It's actually a tier 1 corporate team for national business reorganizations. Just
okay, while we're there, yeah.
For that team. What else do they have? Tax, indirect and direct tax disputes. So it is very much how kind of, you know, traditional law firm would be. You put your preferences in, and then depending on where you are in your training contract, if you're first seat versus fourth seat, you'll then get kind of allocated your seat. They tend to want you to do a contentious seat. So whether that what I did, so in ODC, or whether that's kind of tax disputes, or actually there's regulatory disputes. That's one thing that they are quite keen on, but that's more of an SRA requirement than
of course,
requirement. They also have, or had, I'm not too sure the status of it now because of COVID, but they had a seat to Dubai. And then they also had certain client secondment seats for various kind of public bodies. So yeah, you know, they're able to offer a lot, both in terms of kind of actual seats that you can do, but also secondment opportunities. So that's another thing that I'd put out there. If somebody's figuring out you know, what they want to do, where they want to be, don't necessarily discount you know, the big four, so the ABSs and other places like that, and equally don't discount in-house law firms, sorry, not in-house, in-house companies, because yeah, training is one thing I will say is that a lot of people have, and admittedly I had this viewpoint too, that if I train at a PwC or if I train in-house, that will very much kind of stunt my growth, stuck there. That isn't the case. I think there's always exceptions to the rule. So there are some areas where it might be a bit difficult. But you know, there's people I remember in my pension seat that one of the directors, he trained and he worked in professional negligence for like 10 years and then completely decided to reroute and become a pension lawyer. So even outside of, you know, wherever you train, you know, whatever you decide to specialize in, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to stay there forever. There's so much more autonomy now in the legal sector. You can be a legal consultant, you know, you can kind of go in-house. Like there is genuinely so many more opportunities and avenues now.
No, definitely, I agree. Like I know someone who qualified into tax and was there for a couple of years, and then he decided to move into disputes. And it, like you said, like people, they change their mind. So the flexibility is definitely increasing in the legal sector. So that's good, because we like flexibility. I think my last question, and the last question that we kind of had on the PwC side, was maybe any tips you have specifically for people looking to apply for PwC.
Well, I think the first thing, and I do think this applies to all firms, right? You have to really, really, really know the firm that you're applying to.
100%.
And I do this in like my role now. So it can be information overload. I remember when I was doing my training contract applications, I found it to be incredibly overwhelming. There's a level of granularity that you need to know law firms, because the market is so competitive. It's so fierce. And so what I try to do is I try to make the information come to me. So there are a number of ways you can do that. So signing up to law firms' newsletters, following law firms on LinkedIn. There are also the commercial awareness. There's so many cinemize, I think that's what it's called.
Cinemize, yeah.
Send you daily or weekly updates as to what's happening in the market. All of those things really helped me to kind of keep abreast of what's happening with the firm, because it's that level of granularity. It was always told to me that if I'm doing an application and it says I want to work at a law firm because it is really good for diversity and inclusion.
Yeah.
If we can switch the name of that firm with another
anyone else, yeah,
it's not specific enough. And that actually takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of effort, but it's a necessary evil. So that's one thing I will say. You have to make sure you know the law firm that you're applying to inside out. And also, you know, there are so many other avenues out there. I remember I was shameless towards the end of it. I was reaching out to people on LinkedIn, asking them.
Of course.
And to be fair, people do that to me now, and
yeah.
you know, sometimes I'm incredibly busy and I can't, but I really try my best to respond to those messages, because, you know, there might be people that won't respond, but there will be people that do respond. Everybody's been there. Everybody knows it's very hard to get into law. Everybody knows the countless rejections you have to go through to get there. So we're kind of all bonded in that.
Yeah. In the struggle.
Exactly. So yeah, I think that's, make sure you know the law firm, you know, inside out. Make sure you also know how law firms operate. I think that's so important, and that's really something I realized towards the end. So law firms are a business, and business
I literally wrote that word down just now. Like, I can show you. Law firms are a business. It's so important. Sorry, please go.
You have to know that. So different law firms that have different models. So there are some law firms that have a one profit pool, which essentially means that irrespective of the team, irrespective of the country, it's one big pool. Other law firms, they have I can use NRF as an example. There's NRF UK, there's NRF US, there's NRF in France, and they all kind of operate as their own kind of separate entities. And that does have an impact when it comes to perhaps referring of work, because you're taking money out of your pot to give it into somebody else's pot. You need to understand how law firms operate. You need to understand things like PEP, so profit per equity partner, all of that stuff. And you know, it might not come up in your interviews, it might not be something that you will ever be asked, but I do think that you need to understand it, because ultimately when you qualify, you need to understand how you feed into the wider and the bigger cog. So those are the two things. Make sure you understand how law firms operate generally, and secondly, make sure you know your law firm or your company organization. Make sure you know them to an incredible amount of detail.
Perfect. No, perfectly said. And I think a couple of things I would add. One thing is, like you said, about understanding law firms and how the market operates. There are a couple of like books and stuff that you can read that kind of give you a general understanding about law firms in the market. Like, there are a couple of books by Christopher Stokes, so like something to do with commercial awareness and something to do with law firms. I can't remember the names, but I'll add it to my story after the live with links so that no one like gets it wrong. And there's a couple of books by Commercial Law Academy and the Corporate Law Academy site, which are really good about explaining different terms that you mentioned, and because you need to know them in the application process and interviews and things like that. I think with the topic of law firms as a business, that is extremely important. And it's important even down to the point of what it is you choose to focus on in your application forms. So I know you mentioned previously about like the D&I example, right? So you really like the fact that a firm has a particular D&I initiative. Now, obviously, that is quite automatic to our heads because D&I is important, you know, we're Black, blah, blah, blah. However, D&I doesn't directly make the firm money. Neither does pro bono, neither does CSR. And whilst those initiatives are really, really important, I have seen application forms where the whole of the focus are on topics that don't bring the firm money. And so I think it's important to make sure you're striking a balance in application forms. Make sure that you're talking about deals that they're working on, or their place in the market in a particular practice area, or things that actually create revenue for the firm, and that your whole application form isn't based on things that don't bring the money. And it's quite a controversial thing to say, but I think the balance does need to be struck.
No, I think that's important. And I think that that goes to any job that you're applying for, right? So you're applying to be a trainee solicitor. You're not applying to be a pro bono lawyer. You're not applying to be a diversity and inclusion coordinator. So as much as you find those things attractive, that's fantastic. But they cannot be the be all and end all as to applying for that specific firm. Also, I will go as far as saying that might be controversial. Diversity and inclusion are a hot topic now, and it's sector is for all sectors. There's now a lot more focus on organizations being transparent as to things like gender, you know, kind of certain stats on equal opportunities. So there is kind of very much an impetus for firms to be actively making sure they're hitting their metrics, and also being a lot more transparent, and also appearing as though that they're really trying to be diverse and inclusive, irrespective of whether or not it's like that when you actually join. And so I definitely feel as though kind of the reasons as to why you're applying to the law firm, which is to be a lawyer, you need to make sure that you've made those incredibly clear. And then if there's other things that you want to kind of get involved with, so you know, the culture of the firm, the diversity and inclusion, that's great. But you hit the nail on the head. Like, diversity, inclusion, the softer things that might be secondary to your role should not be the main things that you're including in your application.
Absolutely, because at the end of the day, like, it's a large investment they're going to be making into you, whether that's putting you through law school, or just the salary they're paying you, or the money they're putting into training you up to be a lawyer. So they need to know you're going to bring money in, which means they need to know that when you get there, your focus is going to be the law. So yeah, just something to be aware of when you're doing your application forms, which is really important. Okay, great. So we're trained now. We're looking to qualify. What was the next move? Why is it that you didn't qualify and stay with PwC? And why are we now at NRF?
Okay, so like I said, I was at PwC for 3.5 years, and that didn't include my training contract, actually. And then I trained, and for me, I wanted a traditional law firm. That was mainly because I spent 3.5 years in the team, in the firm. I really wanted that kind of intellectual rigor. I really wanted to be tested. And so in my mind, a traditional law firm was the best way to kind of go about it, which ultimately meant that's why I kind of joined Norton Rose. I stuck with data protection because, quite frankly, I really, really like it. I think it's so interesting. And so, yeah, I mean, pensions, respectfully, that was never going to
Respectfully.
Corporate. You know, actually, corporate was the only one that potentially could have kind of swayed me. But no, I don't want to do litigation or anything like that. So, but yeah, that wasn't going to happen. So yeah, that's why ultimately I made the move to Norton Rose and to do data protection. The thing is with law is, first of all, what you study and how it is in practice is different, and different, like, there's different things that make different people tick, right? Like, some people love the adrenaline of a deal. Other people, they like really, really technical stuff. Other people like stuff that's constantly changing. Other people like stuff where the rules are the rules, and the rules haven't changed in years, and they probably won't change. And there's no right or wrong rule, right? There's people, even in my wider team, because I sit in the team where there's data protection, IP, IT, outsourcing, commercial contracts. Some of the outsourcing lawyers are like, data is disgusting. And I'm like, outsourcing is disgusting. So everybody has their
little niche. Yeah,
exactly.
No, definitely. And honestly, no one should come on and listen to this live and quote me, because in my last live in March, I was doing a Q&A with my friend Ramimo, and she is a disputes and investigation lawyer at TLT. And I went on that live and I said, I'm never doing disputes. And here I am. So no one should quote me. But
never know.
Yeah, we'll see. Okay, great. So we're at Norton Rose now. So talk to us. What is life like as a data protection and technology lawyer? What is it, and what do you do?
Okay. So
the meat of this live, yeah.
I essentially advise clients on all things data protection. So mainly, what I do is mainly risk advisory. So I advise clients on data protection kind of risk in relation to anything specific they want to do with their data, with technology. under data protection law, there are kind of certain rights, there are certain rules, so I assist clients with those. And then there's also kind of the breach side. So, for example, if there is a data breach, which sometimes triggers a regulatory investigation or notifying kind of data subjects that the breach has occurred, I sometimes assist with that. So it's incredibly varied. I don't have a particular sector. My clients, all different sectors. Data protection compliance is incredibly broad, so there isn't just one thing that I help them with. I help them with cookie compliance all the way up to helping them kind of come up with user journeys for their apps, all the way to marketing advice. So it's incredibly
wow.
Yeah, for me, I love it because it's so grey and it's a new area of law. So there's constant guidance, constant case law. So that for me, I like, because I'm constantly learning and I'm constantly growing. And tech is the big thing, right?
100%.
Data is the new oil, and like tech is also quite kind of lucrative too. So it's definitely for me an area that I really, really love. But yeah, it's, what does a day entail? I always find questions like that to be so interesting, because one thing I've found in my role is I can never predict my day, let alone my week, let alone my month. So sometimes, to get ahead of the curve, on Sunday I'll perhaps look at emails, I'll get my to-do list together. And generally, we have a team meeting every Monday at 10:30. Even before that, my whole to-do list could be like completely different. And so, yeah, it's very hard to answer that question. One thing I will say is I do my to-do list. That's a given. I try to kind of keep abreast as to what's been happening. So I sign up to like Lexology and the regulators updates to see kind of what's been happening. And then, yeah, but it's very hard to say each day my day is like this.
Yeah.
It's no 2 days are the same. And I know everybody says it, but that's so true. No 2 days are the same.
Sure. Okay, just in terms of like a general flavor then, do you feel like, or do you find that you do a lot of drafting work? Is it quite research heavy? Do you do a lot of calls with clients? Where does I know it may still be varied, but like generally.
I do a lot of drafting. I do a lot of contracts.
Okay.
Yeah, I do a lot of contracts, sometimes data protection specific contracts, sometimes wider commercial contracts that have a data protection element. I also, for example, with like the corporate due diligence stuff, there's a lot of kind of drafting of reports, like reading through contracts, reading through policies, reading through procedures. So it's definitely a lot of reading, and then a lot of research that I'm having to do, and a lot of drafting. But yeah, it very much depends on kind of what I'm working on, and what the client wants. There is no kind of set.
Yeah. No, I know, but I just feel like anything I can squeeze out of you, I will. So just following on something you just said about like due diligence. So obviously I've done a bit of it, so I know what it entails from the real estate angle. When it comes to like data protection, what is due diligence? What are you looking for?
So I'll say that due diligence is essentially, well, there's a number of flavors, but typically when company A is buying company B, or company A is investing in company B. And as part of that, you have to do your due diligence on the entity that you're buying or the entity that you're investing in. And there's a number of kind of legal reasons as to why that needs to be done. From a data protection perspective, we have a look at a number of things to see where they are in terms of risk. Now, if a company is processing lots of, sensitive personal data, perhaps doing some very novel things with the data, that is a high risk company, that is a high risk, that will be a high risk investment. And so by virtue of that, depending on what we find, it might be a case that we would advise our client to discount the price.
Yeah.
But there are a number of things. So for example, if a company's had a data breach that is currently being investigated with the regulator and may result in a fine, there's a strong possibility that depending on when the company sold, it's, the new entity that will have to bear the burden of that fine. And so, yeah, there's lots of kind of weird wonderful things, but it's just essentially seeing, it's basically kind of going in, seeing what the company's like. Do they have their house in order? Is there anything that we think is so much of a high risk that it warrants a price reduction? And then kind of the legal documentation around that and covering that.
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you. Okay, so I kind of think we've got a good understanding about what work you do generally. Can you tell us, like, what's something really exciting you've been involved in, or what's something in particular that stands out about your career so far that you thought was particularly interesting?
Okay, so I have one client that I've been working with. So, Supreme Committee for Delivery and Legacy. So for those that don't know, that is the entity that the Qatari government created for the World Cup, that's on.
Yeah,
and amazing. I know there's, a number of everybody has a different viewpoints as to the World Cup, where the World Cup was kind of located. But from a legal perspective, it was a really, really, really interesting project to be involved in. I helped them kind of negotiate contracts with certain key vendors, certain things on their website. I kind of helped draft, negotiate. So it was a really, really good client. And because it was so high profile, to be able to just kind of look online and I'm like, I drafted that.
Yeah, that was me.
What was a good one. And I think that client very much reminded me of some of the other clients that I got seconded to, in the sense that they were very much kind of set up just for the World Cup, right? So they're not a very big organization that has been around for decades, that has a lot of the governance structures, that has a lot of the ways of working in place. Like it was kind of like a startup, and a startup that had to kind of elevate and kind of be very operational in a very short period of time. And so that to me I actually found quite rewarding, because there was kind of like the educational element that kind of went with the legal advice, kind of upskilling the people there on as to why certain things needed to be where they were, why certain provisions were incredibly important in a contract. So that was a good client from kind of that perspective.
Nice. And I'm really sorry if I kind of missed this, but in your role as a data protection and technology lawyer, what kind of role would you play with that type of firm? So for example, also you have like sport lawyers, and you have like what type of input are you having? What are you commenting on, or what are you drafting in particular?
So things like kind of privacy policies.
Okay.
So even little things. So I don't know if anybody remembers, but around kind of when GDPR was going into force, everybody was getting those emails about, do you still want to receive?
Yeah. I still get them.
Sectional, and still, so even there's certain very specific rules as to what the wording should say if you're going to market to somebody. What kind of constitutes legal and valid consent, so kind of helping companies through that. The reality is, by virtue of what they were doing, they were processing a lot of data, whether that's for accommodation, whether that's for offering goods or services, and all of that has data protection ramifications. Equally, they weren't conducting the World Cup by themselves. They had a number of third parties that were assisting them, a number of elements that were outsourced, all had data protection and data touch points, which meant that contracts needed to be in place, which adequately kind of covered both parties, made it clear what the obligations are. And so, it was actually, data touched everything.
Right, great.
It genuinely touched everything because of the event.
Amazing. No, that's really good. And I kind of had a vague idea, but I thought it was really important to kind of understand exactly where it factors into, which is good and definitely helpful. I think we have one more question in like our pre-agreed list, and that was just generally, and we have kind of touched on it throughout the live, just different tips and things. But from your experience, both kind of entering the profession and finding your own feet, and your time since qualifying, what tips would you have for aspiring solicitors looking to kind of excel and get in?
I've actually got a list for this.
Go for it.
The first thing I'd say is, don't give up. Like, it's incredibly cliche, but the reality is that getting into law is incredibly, incredibly hard. There are some people that, I remember I'd go to talks and people will say, oh yeah, from the age of 4 I knew I wanted to be an arbitration lawyer, and they only applied to one law firm and they got it. Yeah. But for the majority of people, the journey isn't as smooth sailing. There are a number of hiccups. You face countless rejections. It can be an incredibly disheartening process. So that's the main thing I would say. Don't give up. I would also say be very strategic, right? So you know, like I said, don't think law firms are the be all and end all. There are in-house organizations, there are alternative business structures. Be strategic in terms of the experience that you're trying to get. Like I said, try maybe the smaller law firms. If you're finding it difficult to get into the bigger law firms. I would also say don't discount kind of you know, your customer service experience. Experience is experience.
100%.
There'll be a lot of transferable skills in your experience to other areas. Kind of going back to being strategic is realizing kind of where you are. So for me, my last year that I decided I was going to be really serious, I think I was working full time. And so it was clear to me, I don't have as much time as a student. Like, I don't have it. So for me to say I'm going to apply for 20 law firms in a year, that just wasn't realistic at all. So very strategic and be realistic as to your circumstances. Yeah. And that also goes back to the types of law firms that you're applying to. Mm-hmm. If you know you don't have the best grades, then don't apply to the firm that makes it explicitly clear. Yeah. On, you know, 3As. Like don't do that. Also be very clear as to your motivations for wanting to join that specific law firm. So I know for me, even before I compiled my list, I said, right, what do I want out of a law firm? Do I want a really open law firm? Do I want secondment opportunities? Do I want work-life balance? Like what is your motivation? And based on your motivation, that will arguably guide you to the types of law firms that you should be applying to. To the extent that you can, once you have your list, whether that's one firm, whether that's 10 firms, try and get your foot in the door. So whether that's through open days, insight days, there are so many schemes now. There's Grow Mentoring, aspiring solicitors, who I did some work with. Like, there's so many opportunities out there for you to get an insight into the firm before you even have to go through that very arduous process of doing your application. So I'd say that. Some people say it's a numbers game, right? Some people say do 50 applications. I personally fundamentally disagree with that.
I disagree as well.
Because of the level of granularity that's needed for you to your application to shine, it is just not feasible.
It's not
for you to do
20 amazing application forms. Yeah,
exactly. So yeah, like, you know, have a handful of 5. Like, be realistic with yourself, because what you want is, if at the end of the application year you've only applied to 4 firms and for whatever reason you don't get accepted, you want to be able to look back and say, right, okay, I only did 4 applications, but those 4 applications were absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
It hurts so much more when you get a rejection. You're like, oh yeah, but to be fair, I didn't. That was a bit shoddy. I literally did it a week before. Yeah. So give yourself the best shot, right? Like, give yourself the best shot to be successful and for your application to be successful. And you need to have, you know, devote the time in order for that to be the case.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you said. I think, taking your last point first, I think the reason why they say that, you know, it's a numbers game is because it's the whole practice makes perfect things. But I think when it comes to application forms, that's the complete wrong approach to take. Why? Yeah. Because like you said, well, actually, firstly, the moment you submit an application form to a law firm, if you didn't know you did a rubbish job, they now have a rubbish application from you on their system. That doesn't help you in any way, shape or form. And it couldn't help you. And I think, instead of doing the whole practice makes perfect in terms of just sending application forms for the sake of it, you need to take appropriate steps before they're sent. So like you said, making sure your research is thorough, making sure that you've reached out to people to get their insight. Like, if you know you want to work for a particular firm and you're really interested in a particular part of the firm or area of practice, find a lawyer on LinkedIn that works in that practice, speak to them, get insider information about what the firm's really focusing on in that area. Like, LinkedIn is so important. And like you said, we all try our best to respond to all LinkedIn messages with, like, we try our best. But just because you don't hear from one person doesn't mean you shouldn't reach out to 3 more people on LinkedIn, because someone will respond, and you only need one person to kind of help push that application that little bit further forward, right, in terms of quality. I think another thing you said is really important is the whole, like, getting your foot in the door in terms of, like, experience. So, like, whether that be you're joining open days and insight days through things like aspiring solicitors, or you're applying directly with the firm for open days. Like, you don't have to just apply for training contracts or just vacation schemes. They have all other opportunities that will allow you to just be in the same room as someone who has influence and or has information that they can share. And I think that's really important. And I think finally, on the whole application front, in terms of not just being a numbers game, is getting your application checked before you send it. Like, I think no matter how amazing you think your application form is, if it's flooded with mistakes and you haven't even spelled the firm's name right, it's going nowhere. Like, and it happens so often. I have firms like literally confirm in my DMs, like, yeah, they didn't even spell our firm's name right. And I'm like, well, what do we do now? So, yeah.
And one thing I will say with that in closing is, it doesn't have to be someone that studies law. I remember
it doesn't.
The main thing, right, is the person that's reading your application more times not isn't a lawyer. They're a HR advisor. So
100%.
the main thing that they want to make sure is that they can understand what you're saying, and that you're able to be very succinct and concise and very clear, and the motivation shines through. And sometimes, to be fair, even in my job now, I have to take a step back, because you can get so caught up in, like, the long words and, like, reciting all these bits of law, that when you have a look at the advice now, I'm like, Olivia, this doesn't even make sense. And I think that that's applicable to so many kind of bits that we write. Sometimes we get so caught up in the details that we really do need somebody else who's not so close to the details to come and have a look at it and be like, actually, no, this doesn't really make sense. You could have used that word in a better way, or don't use that word. And so, yeah,
I completely agree.
It has to be someone in law. I remember towards the end, I was getting my mum to read review the applications, which didn't quite go well because she changed everything. But but yeah, like, use the people around you. And there's also so many kind of, I can't remember the name of this website, but essentially you put the text in and it reads it out to you. That's one thing I would say is really good for identifying typos. Yeah. Because working away at an application, you don't necessarily see, oh wait, I've got 2 of the same words next to each other. So yeah, just utilize the people around you, and kind of the resources that are out there. And I think now more than ever is a good time to try and get into law, because there's so many schemes out there. Law firms have changed their approach. So yeah, I think
no, definitely, like, the application cycle that I actually got through in a lot of firms, I just had my friend read them, and she would look at it, she'd be like, Nadine, you haven't actually answered the question. And I would look and I'd be like, okay, I kind of haven't. And she'd be like, because I feel like when you also do a number of applications, you get into that trap of copying and pasting answers, because you think they're both asking me what are the key skills for a lawyer. So you think I can just copy that from my application to another, and you can't, because each law firm will say on their website what skills they're looking for in their trainees. And if you're just copying it, it doesn't actually fit that firm, number one. But number two, when there's a slight nuance to the question, so say, for example, I had one where it was like, tell me a time you've worked in an effective team. And then there was another one that was like, tell me a time when you've had to resolve an issue in a team. And you've copy and pasted it, you haven't answered the question.
Yeah.
So, sometimes you need someone who just understands English to read your answer. So that's important. And one other thing I was going to say, in terms of firms, is another really common question that I would get is, I'd get to interview and they would say, okay, so like, what other firms have you applied for? And I think when you go down the route of, applying to lots of different firms, you can end up applying to firms that are all very, very different, and you don't quite understand why you've applied to all these different firms. So you then don't really want to communicate to the firm you've applied to. A firm is completely different, because you don't really know why you've applied to both of them, and you can't really distinguish between them. So yeah, please, as you said, make a list about what's important to you. Make a list of, like, what you want in a legal career, what you want in a law firm, what opportunities you want to have access to, and then pick firms that meet what you want, because then you'll be able to know why you're applying in the first place. Okay, well, thanks so much, guys, and thank you again, Livia.
You're very welcome. And by the way, if anybody has any questions or anything they want to discuss, find me on LinkedIn. So Olivia Wint, Mint for the W. That's me, and I'll try my best to answer any questions.
But yeah, thanks, Livia. Have a good evening, and bye, everyone. Bye.